Well, hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're with us today for our Lunch and Learn. You know, one of the best parts about being a park ranger in the National Park Service is you get to stay in America's special places and spaces for a long time. You get the chance to enjoy them throughout the seasons and throughout the years, and you get to learn about the stories in a little bit bigger depth. And so today's topic is one that sort of popped into my mind when I was standing outside on the grounds. You know, usually I'm thinking about Pullman, Pullman the man, Pullman the town, Pullman the company. But every now and then my mind drifts just a little bit, and I begin to think, what did this place look like before Pullman got here? What were in the car works grounds? And well, what was here before the car works? And so we're going to spend a little bit of time cruising through that landscape today. I invite you to get comfy, grab your snacks and drinks, and join me for this little bite-sized journey back in time. Please hop into your favorite imaginary time machine, and we'll start the traveling. Let's go. Before the National Park Service joined the scene, the Pullman State Historic Site was here. They came on the scene in 1991. Those of you familiar might spot yourself in the crowd here, centered around the first state site superintendent, Mike Wagenbach. But where was the ownership before the state was here? Well, we'll take a little map adventure look between 1955 and 1979. You can see the red line where my arrow is hovering. That's actually the Clock Tower Administration Building where we're broadcasting from today. In the 1950s and 60s, there was not a great deal of manufacturing going on here in Pullman. It was in other buildings, in Hegwish, the 103rd Street shops. And indeed, shortly after they stopped manufacturing here, the property at the car works was being leased. There were trucking works here, car mechanic works, some industrial storage, other light industry. But let's go back in our time machine just a little farther back. This one's one of my favorite images from the 1930s and 40s. Again, you can see where the red line is. That's the Clock Tower Administration Building. Here you see the front erecting shops intact, the 1908 bump out to incorporate those steel cars, all connected to the rear erecting shops. If you follow my hovering mouse, you see the Corliss engine house. Back here, you see the water tower, mostly by the water tower shadow that's being cast on the ground. You see a little bit of residual of the old Allen paper wheel car wheel shops, and then many of the other industrial buildings back here, as well as some intact train lines. And so you can see going back a little bit closer to what that perfect model town was that George Pullman had envisioned. He started looking around the 1870s, looking for some property to move his Detroit shops, to consolidate manufacturing along with the town for his workers. And it was all location, location, location. The landscape was along the Illinois Central rail lines. They had Lake Calumet. It was underdeveloped, it was rural and farming, and it was especially outside of the city of Chicago and Chicago regulations. And so Pullman built a town and manufacturing, hoping that isolation would keep his workers free from the plagues of some of the ills of society at the time. But who was here before George Pullman and the Pullman Company? I'm going to shift perspectives, head a little bit to the west, climb up that hill that we now know today is Michigan Avenue, and take a look back at the car works. And again, just for your frame of reference, I'm circling the building we're broadcasting from today, that Clock Tower Administration Building. You see the front erecting shops, you see the water tower, a little bit of the Corliss, and then you see this lovely farming landscape with some folks out there, perhaps doing some farming. This was an early photo from 1885 from Henry Koopman. And you might be not surprised that there were Dutch settlers here before Pullman came. This is a fun image from 1910 from a Dutch Cultural Heritage Festival in Palmer Park. I show this photo because it's a little bit more fun to look at than this next one, which is the founding fathers of Roseland. They were Dutch. They came here in the 1840s, And if you look at their last names, Jong, Dallenberg, Jonker, Kuiper, Ton, Vanderslied, Ambule, they were all immigrants looking for religious freedom and an opportunity for economic prosperity here in America. The area was originally considered to be known as High Prairie, not to be confused with the Low Prairie, which was known as the Dutch settlement in South Holland. And for a short time, it was also called Hope, but not too long after that, it became known as the town of Roseland. And those Dutch were here mostly settling around a community where they established a church. Here's an example from 1888 of the first Christian Reformed Church of Roseland. And so that was up on 111th Street. And what were the Dutch doing here? Well, this is from the South Holland area. It's an example of what the farmers would be doing. They'd be taking horse and wagon, and they were considered wagon farms or later truck farms, providing fresh produce for the city of Chicago and also for the rails along the city of Chicago. And so the Dutch had been in this area for quite some time. And there's a good story that is recently told, the John and Aggie Ton Farm. They just celebrated a dedication of the designation of the Underground Railroad site for the Network to Freedom Trail. And the Ton Farm is the site of a memorial plaque and also a marina called Chicago's finest marina. And there you see one of the Ton descendants who came back this year for that memorial. And just a quick look at some of the folks that were helping. I've got Dr. Larry McClellan in the background and our own Pullman resident, Tom Shepard. We've got some of the Gaines family. Mr. Gaines had poor health and wasn't able to join it, but they are the owners and operators of the marina there. We have Dr. Ken Schoon, Alderman Chico, and then also the Netherlands ambassador, U.S. Brigitte Talzar, and I apologize, not being Dutch, I do not have the proper Dutch pronunciation. But they were here just this year on a spring day, celebrating some of the research and community that proves that the Dutch have been here and are still here. But who were here before the Dutch? Well, let's get back in our time machines and go back just a little bit more. The United States government was aggressively displacing indigenous people between the 1700s and the 1800s. Here's a fairly recent contemporary map, and you will see a couple different colors. I did want to point out this line that my mouse is hovering between the pink and yellow zone that actually we'll take a closer look at. But you'll see that there were a variety of 7 treaties over a period of time. And more interestingly, there's some fresh infill landscape on the property of the lakefront that's considered green that Native groups today find as unceded territory, was never ceded, and they have been working government to government to gain access back to that. So again, a little bit deeper dive, taking a closer look. And you'll see where my mouse is hovering, sort of the Pullman area adjacent to Lake Calumet, and just on the southern boundary there, you'll see a point that would have nipped right through the Pullman Land Holding Company that would have been where today Sherwin-Williams is, the paint manufacturing, but it would have been part of the old Pullman brick and clay yards. And so you get a chance to take a look at this map, but also another wonderful chance to look at the actual 1816 Treaty of St. Louis. This is at the Newberry Library, and it's courtesy of the National Archives. And it was a map that was drawn up by lawyers at the time, ceding indigenous land around those valuable Chicago portage routes, and they established those Indian boundary lines. You'll look on the other side and you'll see a listing, just a small blow up listing of many of the names of those indigenous peoples, and they were marking their names by an X, and they were notarized. And so these land residents, these indigenous people, were giving up rights that they may or may not have had, depending on property rights, depending on different cultural viewpoints, to land to the dominant Euro-American government, the United States. And why was this happening in 1816? It was just before the Illinois was designated in 1818, and also as early as 1833, Chicago was going from a sleepy little mouth of the river town to a burgeoning mass transit economic engine. And already by the time of 1833, those indigenous names, those peoples, those voices, they were being relegated to sort of nostalgic images on the edges of maps and nostalgic images along the edges of some of the names and roads that we still have today. But who was here before those folks that signed those treaties? Well, here's a European point of view, carving up a land that was lived in and cared for and cared about by other groups for thousands of years. And you can see around Lake Michigan here, which is where we're going to spend some time looking at some maps, there were some different battles between European groups, the United States, England, Spain, and of course, the Friends from France. Were there French here in Pullman before Pullman was Pullman? Ranger Sioux believes that there were because they were traveling through this area. They were here, they were making maps, they were identifying some of the important waterways, which is where transportation was happening. They were learning the names from the indigenous folks and translating them into French. Les Illinois. It was the Lac des Illinois. It was not Lake Michigan at that time. It was the Lake of the Illinois Indians. And so they were here trapping for beaver. A different relationship that the French had. They were extracting resources from the abundant waterways, swamps, and forests, making a profit, shipping them back to France across the Atlantic. But they were not interested really in making large settlements. They were at the mouth of the Chicago River. They had settlements at the mouth of the Calumet River. There's another home, the Bailey home in Indiana Dunes National Park, where Mr. Bailey married a Potawatomi native, and they had a trading post there that served some of the French traveling along the rivers. And so they are highly likely to have followed some of the same indigenous trails through the Pullman area that the native folks had established that were perhaps on old game routes, but they really weren't interested in necessarily owning and controlling specific plots of land, but they were more interested in moving forward. But before then, who was here? So this is a wonderful example of an 1804 Albert Scharf map, and we're going to take a closer look, but just from the broad viewpoint, you can see that many of our contemporary interstate and highway paths were indeed along old indigenous trails, other native tribal trails, perhaps high ground from some of the geology. And a closer look, we know that there were indigenous people here from the French and English perspectives. Again, you'll see the town of Pullman, a little bit laid out here, the Kensington area, Blue Island with the symbol of a teepee indicating that this map maker felt that there was long-term settlement there. There was long-term settlement also on the other side of Lake Calumet near Wolf Lake. And then on some high ground here, some transitional settlement patterns. But these were not indigenous stories told by indigenous voices from indigenous names. This map was made from a Euro-American or European perspective. Chicago has been known to be a historic crossroads for many different indigenous peoples, and it remains home to an extensive community of urban natives. There were Potawatomi, Odawa, Ojibwe, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Miamia, Wea, Sauk, Meskwaki, which is translated maybe to the fox, and Ho Chunk, which formerly were the Winnebago. And so there are records, oral histories, government treaties that all share that people from the tribes that are mentioned here have passed through the Pullman area on the same roads, byways, and passageways that we are today. And they also may have been living here in permanent settlements or temporary settlements. And so, if you were to talk with them today, they would want to make sure that you know that they are here and always have been here. This is from Springfield, Illinois in 2022. There was the Native American Voices Conference where they were working government to government with state government on some tribal and treaty um, issues between the tribes, but also a celebration of culture and heritage with multiple different indigenous voices. And so you'll see some images of different Native groups also in regalia. And they were working with the Newberry Library to inform this map. So this is not a complete Eurocentric map. It's a combination map, again, talking about seasonal camps, village sites. And if you notice, many of them are following or along the Calumet River and also Wolf Lake, and then a little bit farther south down towards the Kankakee. And it makes sense if you live here year round and you didn't have the benefits of our air conditioning and heating systems, you would move into this wetland area during the summer months, gather, share, trade, celebrate, and also harvest some of the abundant fish and bird and small mammal game that you would have found in the wetlands. But as those cold winds came off of Lake Michigan and it got cold and blustery, you would have moved farther inland and moved along some of those freshwater areas. And again, just a little closer look. And something that was fun for me to find out was in a collaboration of both academics and scholars from the Newberry Library, as well as indigenous voices from the American Indian Center here in Chicago and elsewhere. All of the usage between really 130th and the Bishop Ford. And so not quite so much from what they reported in the exact Pullman area, but certainly along the river area over by the defunct steel plant around 128th. Both French map makers as well as contemporary oral tradition says that there was an unnamed village site there, most likely a Potawatomi, some just south of what is now 130th, and then quite a few seasonal camps. And over here, it's interesting that they identified sort of a work camp, a camp that tools might have been made, harvested, and shared. And so just a reminder, if you get a chance, the Newberry exhibit, Indigenous Chicago, just opened last month on September 12th, and it will be running through January 4th. So who was here before those indigenous folks? Well, scholars and archaeologists believe that there may have been what we would consider prehistoric folks here in the Illinois Great Lakes area, hunting game, actively fishing the rivers, maybe an example of a seasonal camp. While there are no illustrations of what happened here in Chicago, this is an illustration done by the Park Service in Cuyahoga, which is really just a few Great Lakes over. And so you can presume that that might have been what life was like here. There is fossil evidence of both mastodons and mammoths found in the Chicagoland and also Great Lakes area. And there is some evidence of early Pleistocene era folks, peoples that lived and hunted there based on damage to bone fragments and spear points and projectiles found within the bone masses. So we know that before the native tribes that we were able to name and describe, that there were an ancient peoples here in the Pullman area before. But why can't we find evidence of that right here in Pullman? Take a little look at 4,000 years ago. You can see that Lake Michigan had a big glacial blowout down the Illinois River through the Des Plaines area. But if you look at maybe 7,000 years ago, take a look at the fact that the lake has radically shrunk. It's much smaller than it was. While 9,000 years ago, the glacial meltwater had filled up the lake and it exceeded the boundaries of what we know today. And then approximately 14,000 years ago, those lobes of one of three great glacial eras were sinking down. So I show that to show you that this landscape has been carved by geologic processes. But in particular, I wanted to take a quicker look at all this land that is now under Lake Michigan. Were there humans there? Is there evidence of encampment and hunting and fishing and structures there? Ranger Sue likes to speculate about that, but she has no scientific proof or illustration. But that's maybe for some of the scholars that are here today to finish up. If we get in our time machines and go way, way back, and we're talking millions of years ago, this area was rotated on the planet and closer to the equator. And we were in a low basin surrounded by some high mountain ranges that we maybe know today, similar to the Appalachians and Rockies. And we were a vast, shallow inland sea. And so you were finding the Silurian and Devonian creatures, some of those soft body creatures that were sponges, maybe some nautiluses. And they were forming and making sediment in the bottom of that shallow sea. And I say this because it's important to us that sediment and those shallow seas might have supported Illinois' state fossil. This is the Tully monster. It is a small soft-bodied creature with sort of these eye sensors on separate points. Here's a model that the Field Museum recreated based on some fossil evidence. And that fossil evidence came from not too far from Pullman, not here in Cook County, but just over in Will and Grundy counties in what's known as the Mazon Creek area. The Mazon Creek was just perfectly set up for that sediment from all that underwater life to create some nice clay that may have created these fossils or preserved these fossils for the Tully monster. Ranger Alex reminded me, as the teacher that he is, that the Tully monster is the official Illinois state fossil. So were there Tully monsters swimming here, right here in Pullman? I like to dream and speculate that that's a possibility, but there's no proof yet. So no matter how far back you go in the time machine, I can't help but stand and think about the passage of time, who was here before us, and give a nod of appreciation, the clay from those ancient lake bodies that have created the ability for us to make some common brick that would form the red brick buildings that we see today. Those sponges and silica compressed and hauled out of the Thornton quarry to make some of the limestone foundations of the building. And so the past is still a little bit with us and still here today. And what will the future look like? How will visitors be coming to Pullman? How will they be traveling in 50 years, 100 years, 10,000 years? Hopefully you'll be able to keep your time machines and we will all be able to get a sense of understanding of how we can contribute to that story, both by looking in the past and looking forward. And it's a delight that the National Park Service has been invited to be part of that storytelling and caretaking group. With that, we're going to pause and I'm going to ask Ranger Alex to let us know if we have any questions in the chat.